I think is writing about Near the Wild Heart, which overnight made her this phenomenon. And it's an incredibly, the reviews, it's fun to quote from, she's called the princess of the Portuguese language. And she's, people said it's the greatest novel ever written. And this is also the sexism, slightly, but the greatest novel a woman ever wrote in our language. Which is like, it's okay for them, but, I mean, it's not, we're not going to actually, treat it equal to what men can write, but, for a girl, it's okay. And it went, for 2 years, in every week, in every state capital of Brazil, there are articles about this book. And you read these people the reviewers are just dazzled by it, and it's still brilliant. I was talking to my French translator last night, actually, about this. They're redoing some of the old French translations as well, and she's working on Near the Wild Heart. And she said, I can't believe it, it's so good. It's just so, I can't believe a 23-year-old girl wrote this book. And, even after all these years, even knowing what she became, and that she's this iconic figure, and that she went on to write much greater books, it's still an amazing thing.
It's very cool. And how, but you're not translating these. You're editing them.
I'm editing them.
And who's translating them?
4 people. Near the Wild Heart is translated by Alison Intrican, who's an Australian woman who lives in Brazil. It's a very, very outstanding translator. Passion of Green GH is translated by an American poet named Idra Novi. Agua Viva is being translated by a British guy who's sort of like the Chad Post of the UK, actually. He does translations, he has a small press, and he's really active in the translation world.
He's great.
Stefan Tobler is his name, and his press is called And Other Stories. It's really worth following, especially if you're interested in Latin American literature. He does a lot of that. And Johnny Lawrence, who's a Brazilian-American guy from Miami, who actually lives in Brooklyn. But he is doing A Breath of Life. And A Breath of Life is the really posthumous form that is, as hard as this is, this is a piece of cake compared to that, because that's totally unedited. You have no idea what mistakes are real and what mistakes are fake. Do you keep them? I mean, there's this one thing, it's a stupid example, Hudra. She writes about a Hudra truck. Again, this is a dumb example, actually, but, and it's actually a Hydra truck, it's called. But she writes Hudra, and then you think, okay, well, we'll change it to Hydra. But if you do that, then you have to, on that principle, then you have to change 1,000 other things. All the grammar is wrong, and it's just because it's scratches. And yet, when it all comes together, and I was telling Chad, this book is going to be, no one's going to believe how unbelievable this book is. It is one of the most powerful, beautiful things I've ever read. And I think in life, but particularly in publishing and in these sorts of, businesses or as a teacher, I think also, it's pretty rare. A lot of what you do is kind of like really good and you really like it, but it's rare to be dealing with a real work of genius. And that's what you do it for. Like as a publisher or as a journalist or as a reviewer or as a teacher, like that feeling of really putting something on the map, that's really exciting. And I can't wait for this book to be read. No one's going to believe it. It is just unbelievable.
What's it like editing 4 different translators? I mean, the books are very different, I know, from that one to from Near Wild Heart. But like you're trying to get one sort of consistent voice, or what do you?
Aren't ready to do 12 drafts of this, then do something else. No sweat. I understand, but this is going to be a lot of work. It's not going to be your usual translating job. There's a lot of difficulties. First of all, she has one voice. Her voice changes, but it's always her.
Yeah.
From the time she's a girl of 23 to the time she's dying. And there is 3 different dialects of English speakers involved. There's Alison's Australian, Stefan is English, Idra and Johnny are American. And Americans and Australians and Brits talk differently, and they write differently. So that's just a basic difference. There are also 4 different people. Even beyond that, they have different style, they have a different, they'll translate a word differently. But these concepts that keep returning, and my job is to make sure that as a reader, and I hope that these will be taught in schools and that people will read them as a whole and really appreciate her as a writer, is that these concepts keep coming back. And so if you use a different word in some places, I have to step in and say, no, you need to say X, because in this other book that you haven't even read because you're translating this and not the other one, it also is X. And I want to make sure that the evolution of that concept in her philosophy is clear. And also, it's hard work. You just have to go through a lot of drafts to get it right. And I think that it is a real pain. It's a tight deadline. And we're all really aware that even though it's like, yes, we'd rather go out and have a drink and like watch Friends, like we're actually having a real chance to do something that is a real privilege and that we're not going to get to do a lot of times in our lives, to really reveal one of the great writers to first to our own language, and then we hope, like I was talking about, she's going to be published in Chinese as a result of this project, because Chinese people don't read Portuguese, they read English. If you're a Chinese publisher, you don't spend a lot of time in Sao Paulo, you spend your education, your contact with international literature is in English. So, we are all really excited about it, and we all feel really privileged to be doing it, and we're probably going to go to our graves without getting a chance like this. So we're all full of shock and awe, and I just can't wait for people to read it.
All 4 of them are done now too, right? No. How many you have left? Get that to the printer, my friend. Like deadlines.
Believe me. 3 of them, 2 of them are totally done. 1 of them will be done. I'm on a long trip right now. I live in Holland, as you said. So I've been in Brazil. I've been here. I have to go tomorrow, insanely enough. I have to go to France. All in the service of my friend here. And I have to get home and be able to sit down at my computer for a couple of days. And I just haven't had the chance.
Yeah.
It's going to be fine, Chad.
Okay. I'm desperately waiting for these things.
Every
day I check my mail. I'm like, no new directions.
They're going into galleys. 3 of them are going to galleys. I have to write an introduction for 1. I have to do 1 more draft of Near the Wild Heart.
Oh, okay. Very interesting. So, our time is good, right?
You're right on.
Do you guys want to open this up to questions?
Yeah, you couldn't always. We should have said that at the beginning. Feel free. We're not.
I did have one last question for you. Sorry. I'm going to loop back to something that really struck me on page 26 of your book, which I have written down right here. In reading The Hour of the Star, like I said, it reminded me of it's one of the marked ones with the pink.
It's 26.
126.
Oh, 126.
Is that in reading this, it sounded like Virginia Woolf, but it told my own correct narrator. But I guess when You're at Wild Heart came out, everyone was like, oh, you're like Virginia Woolf and James Joyce and all these influences. Just like, I have no idea who these people are. Like, I've never read them. I don't know even who you're talking about, which seems remarkable and strange to me. Like, how do you even explain? Like, she seems like such a pure writer, but to have locked into that same sort of aesthetic is
I think it's historically explainable. There's some sort of ways you can explain it. Obviously, even if she hadn't read, she was a girl, she was like still in college when she wrote this. She hadn't read everything. She read everything eventually, but reading everything takes a long time. She had, I think it's a funny idea that there's something in the air, but I think that in the 20th century, with the crises in the 20th century, the complete breakdown of the old establishment of what people thought was the way things were, in a good way, which is, especially in her day, for things like religious freedom or women being able to vote or these kind of things that happened in the democratic countries. At the same time, in World War I and World War II, you had a complete breakdown of any sort of certainties, religious, political, racial, sexual. These things just collapsed. The whole world collapsed, and artists in all countries, even the ones like Brazil that were farther away, but she wasn't farther away because she had been born in Europe at the same time. You see in every country, people are looking for new forms of expression. People feel like, okay, it was fine for Charles Dickens to write that novel about the little village and whatever, but we're confronted with the death of God. We're confronted with mass murder on a scale that no one had ever imagined before. we have to find a new way of expressing our lives in a way that what our grandparents could have taken for granted for good and bad, that's collapsing. And so I think that's what you have. You have it in painting, absolutely.
Right.
You have it in music, you have it in literature. And so I think that she was probably, there's also a real colonial thing that is very common in Latin America. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not true. But to attribute anything original to like, oh, you must have picked that up in Paris. It's like Brazilians are too dumb to figure out how to make a new way of writing their own language. And so you see these reviews saying like, oh, well, she must have gotten this somewhere. She couldn't just have like been a really creative artist herself. She must have stolen it from someone. And so that's why the Virginia Woolf stuff, she was really offended by that. I think she would. And you know what else she said about Virginia Woolf? Is that she couldn't forgive her for committing suicide. She said, the terrible duty is to go to the end. Which is,
It's kind of intense.
Yeah, so on that note, any questions? It is really true. Just as, I'll talk until someone emboldens themselves to say it or has something to say. The amount of sexism, the amount of racism, the amount of stuff that you get, the amount of anti-Semitism. Like, our world's not that great in a lot of ways, but like, and I'm sure there's still that out there, like in book reviewing even, which is a pretty liberal part of the world. But like, you wouldn't believe what she had to struggle with as a woman writer. It's just amazing.
I would love to hear you talk a little more about this aspect of dealing with 4 different translators in 3 different countries, and because I think, in a way, you're kind of speaking for this woman and making word choices in English, and I'm sure you're making informed decisions, but,
Yeah, everyone does it differently.
Right. I don't really have a question. I would just love to hear you talk more about this experience of, editor and translator.
Well, I start out with all these rules, and I think, okay, this is how we're going to do it, like the Marilyn Monroe thing. I had this rule. I was like, we're not changing her punctuation. We're not changing her